Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to explore a little bit of a broad topic, but it has something to do with the news story that just came out. Um, it's kind of the idea of the hero's journey and why it's kind of an important thing in terms of execution. So there's kind of a fine line you draw between the hero's journey and making your main character into what is a Gary Stu or a Mary Sue. Now, the difference obviously is that a Mary Sue is a female protagonist who is extremely overpowered, and a Gary Stu is a male protagonist who is extremely overpowered. And we've seen both throughout history. But the thing is, there was a bit of news that came out today about Captain Marvel from one of the directors of the movie, who also wrote it. One of the directors is Ryan Fleck. The other one is Anna Boden. Anna Boden was the one that gave this statement. Um, Now, I'm paraphrasing, but the statement basically stated that they had originally planned on doing this kind of drag out, like mano a mano type of fight between Carol Danvers and Jude Law's Jan Rogg at the end of the film. But instead, they chose to just do the ending that we did get in the film, which was Carol Danvers just immediately blasts him with an energy blast, and then it's all over. Now, let's before we get too much into Captain Marvel as a whole, I've already given my thoughts on the film in total, and there's a reason why I haven't been just been making video upon video upon video on it, is because it's just going to be reiterating the same point. But this kind of goes into a bigger argument and a bigger thing now in films that people are having issues with. Again, similar to the Star Wars franchise with the Rey character. And again, nothing I'm about to say is anything against Brie Larson or Daisy Ridley from a personal basis. I may disagree with their politics and some of the ways that they conduct themselves, but as far as problems with the movies, I don't think that's their fault. I think that falls more on the directors and the writers and the people that are producing the film, as opposed to them as actresses. So, moving forward, when you construct a hero's journey, and a lot of people like to point to when you construct a hero's journey, it's basically three phases. You have your, again, kind of like any story structure, you have your beginning, your middle, and your end. So at the beginning of your hero's journey, your hero is very inexperienced. They don't know what they're doing. They lose, or they have issues, or they have obstacles that they need to overcome. And that's kind of the main point of the early parts of the story, is to kind of get you rooting for this character, even though they're not quite where they need to be at this point. Then the middle part is where they kind of go through the journeyman phase. A lot of people like to say this is kind of the dark phase, or this is where the hero kind of gets to their lowest point. And then the third phase is when they finally become the hero that they are supposed to be, and they fulfill, whatever their mission happens to be. And a lot of people use Luke Skywalker as a very base example of this, and really he's almost the purest example of this sort of thing, where he starts out, he doesn't really know what to do, and then he has this basically one moment of triumph in the original Star Wars film where he blows up the Death Star. Then you go through Empire. He's learning to be a Jedi. He fights Vader, but he loses. And then in the final episode, you have him fight Vader again, but this time he wins because he has conquered his inner darkness and all of these demons, and he's survived all these trials and tribulations. He is the perfect example of what you would like of the hero's journey boiled down to its purest form. Now, you can add things and subtract things from that. You can change all the variables and stuff like that, but ultimately, that's the structure you want to follow. Now, in Captain Marvel, what we had was the first two acts I don't have too big of an issues with. Again, I nitpicked them a little bit in the review that I did of the film, but for the most part, the first two acts are at least serviceable to okay. They're kind of good. The third act of the film is where everything falls apart, because the hero's journey has now been destroyed. You have essentially taken away any kind of obstacle that Carol Danvers had. And really, the better fight scene in Captain Marvel is, as opposed to, when she blows up the massive Kree current command ship, and she blasts Jude Law. The best fight scene is her versus the Star Force. When she's on the ship, that's probably the best fight scene, and ultimately she gets overpowered at the end of it. Even though she manages to kind of wipe the floor with a few of them, she ultimately loses at the end until she is able to unlock her true potential. So here's where things get kind of fuzzy in this. If you had gone the route that the directors were originally going to go when they wrote the screenplay, I think you would have had a much more satisfying ending to that film, because you build up the Jude Law character. You build him up as kind of the villain throughout the film. He starts out as a mentor figure, and then you find out later on that he's been hiding all this stuff from Carol Danvers. So by the end of the film, he is the villain. He is the main antagonist. And what Anna Boden literally says is they wanted the end of the film to mirror the beginning of the film, where they have the sparring match, and she has to use, in the beginning, she has to use her powers to defeat him in the sparring match, as opposed to just physically defeating him. And at the end, they wanted it to mirror that, except they wanted her to win. And for those who are missing context on this, at the very end of the film, after she has blown up the Kree command ship, which again I think is a dumb decision, after she's blown up the Kree command ship, she crash lands, or she lands on Earth. Jude Law's ship crash lands, and Jude Law gets out and basically kind of tries to goad her into a physical confrontation because it's his only chance to win. Now, the reasoning behind why they said Captain Marvel did not engage in this hand-to-hand combat and then just blasted him anticlimactically at the end is that they felt that it wasn't true to the character, because she doesn't need to prove anything to him by playing by his game. I'm sorry, but she does need to prove something to him. The only reason why you would say this is because this does not fit your third act train wreck that is basically just a Mary Sue power fantasy. Because that's essentially what the last 15 to 20 minutes of this film is. It is a power fantasy, as opposed to an actual end to what would be a one film arc for a hero's journey. And the reasoning behind that is that the whole point is that she needs to overcome the issues that she's been having over the first parts of the film. And her main issue at this point is defeating Jan Rog. Now, as far as satisfying, yes, she could just blast him. That's an argument that has been made many times over in many different films. Like, why doesn't he just do this? Why don't they just do that? And the reasoning behind a lot of the times where they don't do things like that is because it is extremely anticlimactic, and it doesn't give you any kind of a sense of, weight to the situation. It's like, okay, if this character can just blast this other character into oblivion, then why are we having this fight? It's essentially just a weird little thing that they decided to do. They decided to scrap this whole thing and then just wipe him off the face of, and then just, blast him, and then she sends him back to the Kree homeworld to basically tell the Kree to go screw themselves. But that is not the hero's journey, and the line that they crossed was when Carol Danvers got all of her power. And they show this. The Captain Marvel is a film that could have worked in terms of being a functional film. I don't think it could have been a great film, but in terms of being a functional film, if you had eliminated the entire Ronin subplot where he comes to Earth and all that, eliminate the whole thing, and if you had left in the fight at the end where she fights Jan Rog, because at the end of the movie she essentially blows through his little spaceship. She like cuts a wing or something off of it, and he crash lands, and then she fights him. if you had that happen where she hits the ship and she's damaged or something like that, and she hits the ground and they're both kind of messed up, and then he gets out of the ship and they finally have this big throwdown because he has like these magnetic gauntlets, or these telepathic gauntlets that lets him like levitate certain things. So if it kind of puts him a bit more on even ground because she can project the energy blasts. So if you had that and her, and they're just in the desert there, there's nobody around, and you had this huge superhero throwdown in the middle of the desert between these two, and it was just a drag out whatever fight to the finish, that would have been a great climax to this movie, as opposed to what they did, because they were not making a hero's journey, which is what this should have been. They were making a power fantasy. And there's two different kinds of power fantasies. I shouldn't say two different kinds, but power fantasies can be done with men and women. Superman is another good example of a power fantasy, especially early versions of Superman, where nothing could hurt him. You know, when Superman came out in 1939, I believe, was when the first comic was printed. You know, for a large majority of his early publications, nothing could hurt him until they introduced kryptonite, and then gradually they introduced more and more things over the years to kind of nerf him, I guess is the best term to use, where he basically, you know, now he's still extremely powerful, but he has more weaknesses, and they've kind of toned down how powerful he is, and introduced characters into the universe that are just as powerful as him. Now, like I said before, when you make a character that powerful, you lose the attention of the audience, because if the audience is very nonchalant about, you know, the fact that the character is in danger, if they've invested in a movie, if they've invested 2 hours into this character, and they know already by the end of the film that there's no imminent threat to them, that they're just going to mop the floor with everything, then there's nothing to invest in that final act. So it is a problem. It's a problem with the filmmaking. And that's also what kind of has me concerned about Captain Marvel too, because if Marvel were to, let's say, after the first film came out, it did make $1 billion, but it made $1 billion because of two separate things. It made $1 billion because of the Marvel bump, because it's an MCU film. It's going to make a certain amount of money no matter what. And because it came out right before Endgame, and people thought they were going to get a sneak peek at Endgame if they went to go see Captain Marvel with a post-credit scene. The post-credit scene showed basically next to nothing, and again, the movie came out at a time when there wasn't a lot of other big stuff that was hitting theaters. Again, Endgame was a few months off, Shazam was a few months off, but there's a lot of reasons why that made $1 billion. But as far as the response from people, it was relatively lukewarm to negative for most people outside of the major media people that were toting this film. And we saw it before with Jon Favreau, where when he came out with Iron Man 2, it made a buttload of money. It made more money than the first Iron Man, but it did not get universal praise. There were mixed emotions about that film, and they decided to take Jon Favreau off of the third Iron Man film and replace him with Shane Black. Now, I assumed that Marvel would do this with Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, because they obviously did not know how to finish off that film properly and give the audience some sense of weight to that final act. Which, again, I go back to Star Wars. You look at Luke Skywalker's fight with Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi. It is an epic fight. The music, everything that's going on in the fight, there's a lot of back and forth stuff. You don't necessarily know if Luke can even beat him right now. The Emperor is there. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if the Emperor is going to kill him. Luke is essentially in a situation where there's a very big possibility he's going to lose. But in the end, he wins. But we've seen him fail so many times up to that point, which is why that final victory, as slim as it is in some cases, is ultimately fulfilling. And that is what the Captain Marvel film at the end lacked, is that fulfillment. And I would have expected Disney to replace those two on the following film, because if they failed to do the first film correctly in terms of the climax, I don't have much faith for the second film. So it's going to be interesting moving forward, but this does show to me, especially this statement shows that Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck should probably go back to doing what they were very good at, which was making indie films. You know, for an indie film, you don't need to follow the hero's journey. You don't need to follow anything. Like, you just need somewhat of an interesting story and insert some social dialogue, usually for an indie film, or for a Oscar contender or whatever you want to call it. So it's very interesting to kind of see that from them, that they had that in mind and then they scrapped it because it didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to tell. And the narrative that they told was trash, at least for the end of what they were talking about with the third act. So I don't know. This is kind of interesting to me, just from a standpoint of examining how a director's mind is working, because a lot of them don't come out with some of this stuff after the fact. So, you know, every once in a while we hear like trickles out of like, oh, you know, we were thinking of doing this and then we wound up doing something else instead. Usually it's with bigger films, and again, like Captain Marvel or Endgame or something like that. So, again, this is kind of an interesting thing. I know I didn't go too much as much into the hero journey as I wanted to, but again, it's just kind of it's a proof of concept in terms of the compare and contrast between what we would consider to be the purest form of the hero's journey, which is the journey of Luke Skywalker, as opposed to the hero's journey for Captain Marvel, which is flawed in many ways. So, I don't know. Put in the comments what you think about this. Would you have, if you did see Captain Marvel, would you have rather have seen a fight between Jude Law and Carol Danvers at the end, as opposed to what we actually did get? You know, do you want to see a second film? Do you want to see, you know, do you want to see Carol Danvers, you know, go on another adventure, or are you just kind of done with it at this point? You know, leave your thoughts in the comments. I like to read them. I like to know what you're doing. And hit the bell for notifications, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?